The rain that fell on Veltrano City that Tuesday night didn't fall so much as it collapsed, sheets of it slamming against the pavement like something angry had been unleashed from the sky. The kind of rain that made people lock their doors, pull their curtains, and decide that whatever they needed from the outside world could wait until morning. Cassio Renard did not lock his door. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 43rd floor, his back to the room, a glass of untouched bourbon balanced in his right hand with the casual precision of a man who had long ago learned to look relaxed while calculating the exact number of ways any given moment could turn lethal. The city below him blinked and shimmered through the downpour, 10,000 lights smearing into watercolor streaks against the glass, and he watched it the way a general watches a battlefield he already owns. He was 41 years old. Silver threaded through the dark hair at his temples like wire through expensive fabric. His jaw carried 3 days of shadow that nobody had ever dared suggest he shave. His suits were Italian, his shoes were handmade, and his eyes, a shade of gray so pale they looked almost colorless in certain light, had a quality that made people instinctively lower their voices when he entered a room, even if they had no idea who he was. People who did know who he was didn't lower their voices. They stopped breathing entirely. Cassio Renard was the head of the Renard Syndicate, the most quietly powerful criminal organization in the Northern Hemisphere. Not the loudest, not the most theatrical. The Renard Syndicate didn't blow up cars or make public examples of enemies. They simply made problems disappear with the kind of thoroughness that left no questions worth asking. 3 governments had attempted investigations. All 3 had quietly shelved them within 6 months. Nobody talked about why. Tonight, however, Cassio was not thinking about governments or investigations, or the 14 ongoing operations his lieutenants were running across 9 countries. He was thinking about the phone call he'd received 40 minutes ago. His head of security, Drav Osai, a Ghanaian-born former Interpol agent who had switched sides 12 years ago for reasons he'd never fully explained, and Cassio had never fully believed, had called from the lobby of this very building with an unusual tremor in his voice. Drav Osai did not tremble. Drav had once calmly reported an assassination attempt while he was actively being shot at, his tone carrying all the urgency of a man reading a grocery list. Tonight, his voice had been different. "Boss," Drav had said, "there's a situation in the parking garage. Sub-level 2, I think you need to come down yourself." Define situation. A pause long enough to be significant. "A child, sir." Cassio had set down the bourbon. He'd picked up his jacket. He'd taken the private elevator down 39 floors without saying another word, because in 20 years of running an organization built on controlled chaos, a child in his parking garage at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in a rainstorm was the one variable he had never once planned for. Sub-level 2 of the Renard Tower parking garage smelled of motor oil and wet concrete, and the particular metallic coldness that underground spaces accumulate like debt. The fluorescent lights buzzed with that specific frequency that lived just below conscious hearing, but above comfort. Cassio stepped off the elevator with Drav at his shoulder, and 3 of his men forming a loose perimeter 20 feet back. Not because they thought a child was dangerous, but because anything unexpected in Cassio's world carried the potential to be a delivery mechanism for something far worse. He saw her immediately. She was sitting on the ground between a black SUV and a concrete pillar, her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them so tightly her small knuckles had gone pale. She was perhaps 5 years old, maybe 6. It was hard to tell, with dark, tangled hair plastered wetly against her face and neck, which meant she'd been outside in the rain before finding her way in here. She was wearing a yellow raincoat that was 2 sizes too large, the sleeves folded back multiple times to free her hands, and one boot. Just one. The left foot was wrapped in what appeared to be a plastic grocery bag, secured at the ankle with a hair tie. She was not crying. That was the thing that stopped Cassio 4 feet from her, and held him there for a moment he could not fully account for later. She was not crying. She was staring at the ground in front of her with the concentrated, deliberate stillness of someone who had already cried everything out, and arrived at something harder and quieter on the other side of it. He crouched down to her level, slowly, the way you might approach something wild that had learned to be afraid of sudden movements. "Hey," he said. It was not a word he used often. It felt strange in his mouth. She looked up. Her eyes were brown, the deep, warm brown of river clay, and they assessed him with a directness that was so far beyond her years that something in his chest shifted uncomfortably. She looked at his face for a long moment. Then she looked past him at Drav, and at the men behind Drav. She looked at the cars. She looked at the elevator. She appeared to be running calculations of her own. Then she looked back at him, and her small face rearranged itself into something that was almost, not quite, but almost the beginning of a decision. She leaned forward slightly. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a breath, directed only at him, low enough that Drav behind him couldn't possibly have heard. "Pretend you're my dad," she whispered. "Please. There are bad men looking for me, and if they find me and you're not my dad, they'll take me somewhere bad." The garage was silent except for the buzzing lights and the distant percussion of rain on the street above. Cassio Renard, the man who had once sat across a table from a rival boss and calmly eaten an entire meal, while the man's bodyguards attempted to intimidate him. The man who had never once in his adult life been caught off guard by anything, felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the building's foundation. He studied her face for 3 full seconds. Then he did something that would be talked about in hushed tones by every single one of his men for the next 4 years. He reached out, gently tucked the wet strand of hair away from her face, and said, in a voice that was entirely different from any voice his men had ever heard him use, quieter, steadier, something almost warm living in the undertones of it. "What's your name?" "Petra," she whispered. He held her gaze. "Okay, Petra, I'm your dad." He straightened up, turned to Drav, and what he said next, what came out of the mouth of the most feared man in Veltrano City, made Drav Osai, former Interpol agent, hardened veteran of 17 undercover operations, take one involuntary step backward. "Get me a dry blanket and find her other boot," Cassio said. "And if anyone comes into this garage in the next 10 minutes that I haven't personally approved, they will regret the decision for whatever remains of their evening. Are we clear?" "Crystal, sir," Drav said. And from that moment, nothing in Cassio Renard's life would ever be the same again. What was it about one small girl in a yellow raincoat that could crack open a man like Cassio Renard? Think about that as this story unfolds, because the answer will surprise you. The story of Petra didn't begin in that parking garage. It began 6 days earlier, in a part of Veltrano City that the 43rd floor couldn't see even on a clear day. A neighborhood called the Thresh, where the buildings leaned against each other like tired old men, and the streetlights worked on a rotation system that nobody had ever officially organized, but that the residents had nonetheless memorized. Solen Vash had lived in the Thresh for 3 years. She was 34, though she looked both older and younger depending on the light, older in the lines of careful vigilance around her eyes, younger in the way she moved, quick and quiet, like someone who had grown up in spaces that required you to take up as little room as possible. She had dark amber hair that she kept in a braid because she had no patience for anything that required maintenance. A narrow scar along her left collarbone from an incident she described to anyone who asked as a cooking accident, and to nobody as what it actually was, and hands that were slightly too rough for someone who worked as a data analyst for a mid-level logistics company. But Solen Vash was not primarily a data analyst. She was a mother. Petra, her daughter, her reason. Her singular fixed point in a world that had spent the last 3 years trying to unfix everything, had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and a laugh that sounded like it had been borrowed from someone much larger. Petra collected bottle caps and called them coins from other countries. Petra had strong opinions about which clouds looked like animals and was willing to defend those opinions at length. Petra had recently decided that the word obviously was her favorite word in the English language, and deployed it with a frequency that Solen found both exhausting and secretly magnificent. Petra was 5 years old, and she was the only clean thing in Solen's life. Because Solen's life, beneath the logistics job and the Thresh apartment and the careful, ordinary surface of it, was built on a secret that was slowly, incrementally, running out of places to hide. 3 years ago, Solen had witnessed something she was never supposed to witness. She had been in the wrong place, a parking structure as it happened, the bitter irony of which she had never fully processed, when 2 men she didn't know had done something to a third man she didn't know, and she had seen enough of it, and enough of their faces, to understand that the correct response was to run, and the incorrect response was to ever speak about it to anyone. She had run. She had not spoken about it. But she had also, in the breathless, panicked aftermath of the running, made one catastrophic mistake. She had dropped her phone. Not just dropped it and had it picked up by a security camera on the level above, the footage of which she hadn't known existed until 8 months later when a man she'd never seen before sat down across from her at a coffee shop, placed her old phone case on the table between them and said, very quietly, "You have something that belongs to our employer. A memory. He'd like it back." That had been the beginning of 3 years of running a different kind, slower, more careful, but no less desperate. Moving twice, changing jobs once, building a life that was as anonymous as she could make it while still giving Petra something resembling stability, something resembling normal, something resembling the childhood she deserved. The men, she had come to understand they worked for someone named Bale Cross, a name that people in the Thresh spoke the way people spoke about bad weather, as an ambient threat rather than a specific one, had found her twice. Both times she'd moved before they could do more than make their presence known. Both times the message had been the same. Give us what you know, confirm what you saw, and we'll find a use for you. Refuse, and we'll find a different kind of use. She had refused both times. The third time they found her, 6 days before Petra ended up in a parking garage, whispering to a man she'd never met. Solen wasn't home. She had been working late, genuinely, legitimately working late. The mundane kind of late that involved spreadsheets and a cold cup of coffee, and the low hum of an office building at 9 p.m. And Petra had been with their neighbor, Mrs. Alluri, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher who made exceptional lentil soup, and asked no questions about why Solen sometimes came home looking like she'd been running even when she hadn't been. When Solen came home that night and found her apartment door open, not broken, not forced, just open, the way someone opens a door when they want you to know they can, she had stood in the hallway for 4 full seconds before her training kicked in. Not professional training, survival training, the kind you acquire through 3 years of being hunted. She had not gone inside. She had gone directly to Mrs. Alluri's door, knocked twice in the specific pattern Petra knew meant come to the door quietly, and when Petra appeared still in her day clothes, bottle cap collection clutched to her chest, eyes wide and reading her mother's face with that unnerving accuracy. Solen had crouched down, held her daughter's face in both hands, and said the words they had practiced but she had hoped never to use for real. "Sparrow Protocol," she'd said quietly. Petra had nodded once, very seriously. "I'll find you," Solen had said. "No matter what, I will find you. But right now you need to run to the place we talked about, and you need to stay there until I come or until you find someone with kind eyes who you're sure about. You understand?" "Obviously," Petra had said. Even then, Solen had almost smiled. She'd kissed her daughter's forehead, handed her the small emergency pack she kept at Mrs. Alluri's for exactly this purpose, which contained, among other things, a large yellow raincoat that had been bought for a Petra 2 sizes from now, and watched her daughter disappear down the back stairs with the focused, deliberate calm of a child who had been loved well enough to be brave. Then Solen had turned around to deal with whoever was in her apartment. What she hadn't anticipated was that there were 3 of them, and that they weren't there to negotiate. She left the apartment 20 minutes later with a split lip, 2 cracked ribs, and the absolute certainty that Bale Cross had decided the time for messages was over. She also left with something she'd taken from the coat pocket of the largest of the 3 men, a secondary phone, locked, but containing in its photo gallery a single image that she recognized immediately. It was a photograph of Cassio Renard, and written beneath it in the Notes app that the phone had opened to by accident when she'd powered it on. "If she runs to him, let her. He won't help her. Nobody does business with a liability. Just watch and wait." Solen had stared at that note for a long time. Then she'd thought about where Petra would run, the place they'd talked about, the safest-looking building in the whole Thresh-adjacent district, the one Petra had once pointed to from the bus and said, "That one looks like nobody bad would be allowed inside." It was, in fact, the Renard Tower. Petra had no idea who owned it. She just knew it looked safe. And now Bale Cross's men were planning to let her run there, and watch, and use whatever happened next. Which meant Solen had approximately no time to think, and a great deal of ground to cover. She ran. Have you ever had to trust a complete stranger with the most important thing in your life? Drop a comment, because what Solen did next took a kind of courage most of us will never understand. Cassio Renard had a penthouse. He also had a guest suite, 4 spare rooms, a housekeeper named Gloris who had worked for him for 11 years, and had the particular quality of being entirely unshockable, and a kitchen that cost more than most people's apartments. He had never had a 5-year-old in any of these spaces. Petra sat at the kitchen island, wrapped in a cashmere blanket that was approximately the size of a small country, wearing a pair of Cassio's socks that went up to her thighs, eating toast with butter and regarding the kitchen with the focused appreciation of a restaurant critic. "Your toaster is very fast," she informed him. "It is," Cassio agreed. He was standing at the counter with his arms crossed, watching her, and attempting to reconcile the fact that he was doing this at all. "Our toaster takes forever," she continued. "My mom says it has a personality disorder." "Your mom sounds like she has a sense of humor." Petra considered this. She has a lot of senses. She can tell when something's wrong before it happens. She calls it reading the room, but she can read rooms that are really far away. She took a bite of toast. "Are you actually a nice person?" Cassio blinked. In 30 years of navigating conversations with some of the most dangerous and strategically sophisticated people alive, nobody had ever asked him that particular question that directly. "What makes you ask?" "Because nice people don't always look nice," Petra said, with the absolute confidence of someone who has worked this out through extensive research. "And not nice people sometimes look really nice, so looks don't help. I have to ask." "And if I said yes, I'm a nice person, would you believe me?" She studied him the way she'd studied him in the garage. That river clay gaze, measuring things he couldn't identify. "I'd believe that you wanted to be," she said finally, which was so unexpectedly precise that he had to look away for a moment. Drav appeared in the kitchen doorway, caught Cassio's eye, and made the smallest possible gesture toward the hallway, the gesture that meant when you have a moment, there are things you need to know. Cassio held up one finger. 1 minute. "Petra," he said, "do you know your mom's phone number?" "Yes." "Can you tell it to me?" She recited it without hesitation, a landline number, he noticed, which was either old-fashioned or deliberate. He didn't write it down. He had never needed to write things down. "Is she coming here?" Petra asked. "I'm going to try to find her." "She said she'd find me. She always does." There was no anxiety in this statement. It was simply a fact delivered with the certainty of a physical law. Gravity pulled things down. The sun rose in the east. Her mother found her. "But she got hurt tonight," Petra added more quietly. "Her ribs, I think. She was trying not to show it, but I could tell from the way she was standing." Cassio went very still. "How do you know she got hurt?" "Because when she hugged me goodbye she held her breath," Petra said simply. "She always squeezes when she hugs me. She didn't squeeze tonight, so something hurt." He looked at this child for a moment, this small, sharp, exhausted, extraordinary child, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time and couldn't immediately name. "Gloris is going to sit with you," he said. "She makes excellent hot chocolate." "Does she put the little marshmallows in?" "She will if you ask her." Petra appeared to find this satisfactory. She took another bite of toast. Cassio walked to the hallway where Drav was waiting, and the two men moved to the far end of it before either spoke. "Talk," Cassio said. Drav spoke quietly and quickly in the way he did when things were moving fast and facts needed to be delivered without decoration. The child had been found by one of the garage security team who'd noticed her slipping in through a maintenance entrance. The same entrance, Drav noted, that appeared on no official floor plan, and that perhaps 15 people in the world knew existed, which raised its own questions about how the girl had known to use it. She had no ID on her. She had a small backpack containing a change of clothes, a Ziploc bag of bottle caps, a handwritten note in a child's handwriting that said, "My name is Petra, and my mom is Solen, and she is coming," and a single photograph, creased, slightly damaged at one corner, of a woman and a small girl on what appeared to be a beach somewhere, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "The number she gave you," Drav said. "I ran it before I came in here. It's registered to an address in the Thresh. Building's been under intermittent surveillance for the last 18 months. "Whose surveillance?" Drav's jaw was tight. "Bale Cross." The name landed in the hallway like a stone, dropped in still water. Bale Cross was not Cassio's enemy. He was not precisely Cassio's anything. They occupied adjacent spaces in Veltrano's underworld the way two storms occupy adjacent weather systems, aware of each other, occasionally overlapping, never directly colliding because both understood the cost of that collision. Bale ran a different kind of operation, less structured, more brutal, the kind that left fingerprints because it didn't care about leaving fingerprints. He had people watching a woman in the Thresh, and now that woman's child was in Cassio's penthouse. "What does Cross want with a woman in the Thresh?" Cassio asked. "Unknown, sir. But given that the child appeared here tonight, I'd guess whatever it is, it escalated." Cassio was quiet for a moment. "Put someone on that address, quietly, and find out where the mother is. If she's coming here, she'll be on foot. She won't use a cab because a cab creates a record. Check the South Corridor cameras. She'd come from the Thresh side." Drav nodded and moved. Cassio stood in the hallway for a moment more, thinking, before something made him turn back toward the kitchen. Petra was still eating her toast. Gloris had appeared, stout, unflappable, 60-something, wearing a bathrobe over her clothes because she'd already been in bed when summoned, and was standing at the stove heating milk with the unhurried competence of someone who had decided this was simply the next thing that needed doing. As Cassio watched, Petra looked up at Gloris and said, "My mom says people who make food for strangers have good hearts." Gloris glanced at her. "Your mom's a smart woman." "Obviously," said Petra. Cassio went to make a phone call. The call he made was not to any of his lieutenants. It was not to his lawyers, or his security team, or the network of informants he maintained across the city like a web of nerve endings. It was to a woman named Thessaly Browd, who had once been a forensic investigator for the city police department, had left under circumstances that were complicated, and that Cassio's organization had been peripherally involved in, and who now operated as a private intelligence consultant in a small office above a dry-cleaning business on the east side of town. Thessaly answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. Thessaly was almost always awake. "I need a name," Cassio said without preamble. "Solen Vash, lives in the Thresh. Connected somehow to Bale Cross, not willingly, I don't think. I need to know why." A pause, the sound of typing. "That's a short name for a lot of history," Thessaly said. "How much history?" "Enough that I'm surprised it's taken this long for it to land on your desk. Give me 40 minutes. Give me 20. Give me 30, and I'll give you everything." He gave her 30. In that 30 minutes, he returned to the kitchen, sat across from Petra, who had graduated from toast to the hot chocolate Gloris had produced with small marshmallows, plural, and did something he genuinely could not explain to himself. He talked to her. Not interrogation, not strategic information gathering. He talked to her the way you talk to someone when you've temporarily set down the version of yourself that you carry in public. She told him about the bottle caps and the cloud animals and her theory that Mrs. Alluri's lentil soup had healing properties. He told her, after she asked, that his favorite thing about the city was the way it looked from above when it rained. She said that was a weird favorite thing. He said he supposed it was. "Do you have kids?" she asked. "No. Do you want them?" He considered the honest answer to this. "I never thought about it much." Petra appeared to find this inadequate. "You should think about it. Kids are really interesting. I'm interesting." "You are extremely interesting," he agreed. "My dad didn't think so," she said, with the matter-of-fact casualness of a child delivering information she had long since metabolized. "He left before I was born. My mom says that was his loss and she means it. She's not just saying it." Something moved through Cassio's chest, quiet and hot and difficult to categorize. "Your mom's right," he said. Petra looked at him with those measuring eyes. "You said it the same way she does," she observed. "Like you mean it too." His phone rang. He stood, moved to the window. Thessaly's voice arrived calm and precise in his ear. Solen Vash, 34, data analyst, 3 years in the Thresh. Before that, 2 years in the Meridian District under a slightly different version of her name. Before that, a pause before that. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time in a parking structure on the south side. And she watched 2 of Bale Cross's lieutenants dispose of a city councilman named Draven Foss, who had apparently declined to stay bought. Cassio's hand tightened on the phone. "She saw it," Thessaly continued. "She was never supposed to see it. She ran. They've been cleaning up behind her ever since. The interesting part, another pause, this one waited, is that Cross doesn't want her dead. He wants her turned. She has enough to put 3 of his senior people away permanently, and he's been trying for 3 years to either buy her silence formally or leverage her into becoming something useful. She keeps refusing. Why hasn't he just killed her? Because the information she has is also stored somewhere he hasn't been able to locate. She set up a dead man's switch. If she doesn't check in on a specific schedule, everything she knows goes to 4 separate journalists and 2 federal contacts simultaneously. He can't kill her until he finds and dismantles the switch. And she won't tell him where it is. A beat. She's been protecting her daughter this entire time. The child apparently knows nothing, which is the only reason Cross has left the kid alone. Cassio looked across the kitchen at Petra, who was trying to count her marshmallows. "Where is the woman now?" he asked. "That," said Thessaly, "is the part you need to hear." Solen had made it 6 blocks from her apartment before they picked up her trail again. She knew they were behind her, not by sound, not by sight, but by that room-reading sense Petra had described, the one that processed 100 microsignals below conscious thought and delivered its conclusions as a feeling in the back of the neck. She turned left instead of right, cut through the laundry alley behind the Thresh Community Center, ducked into the 24-hour pharmacy on Corville Street, and spent 90 seconds browsing cold medicine while watching the door in the security mirror above the register. 2 of them, the kind of men who wore their threat like a cologne, something about the way they held their stillness that made it clear stillness, wasn't their natural state. Her ribs screamed. She breathed through it, counted, let the pain be information rather than obstacle. The pharmacy had a back exit through the stockroom. She knew this because she knew every back exit in a 12-block radius of her apartment, the way a musician knows a piece of music, not by thinking about it, but by having gone over it enough times that it lived in her body. She bought the cold medicine, because leaving without buying something would stick in the cashier's memory, and walked toward the back with the purposeful non-urgency of someone heading to the restroom. The stockroom door was propped open with a fire extinguisher. She stepped through it, let it close behind her, and moved. The back street was empty except for 2 dumpsters and a cat on a ledge who regarded her with imperial disinterest. She moved north, parallel to the main street, using the sound of the rain to cover her footsteps. 4 blocks. 6. Her ribs reduced her to a half-run, something between a fast walk and a controlled fall forward, but she kept moving because the alternative to moving was unacceptable. Renard Tower. That was where Petra would be. That was where she was going. She had looked up after finding that phone and reading that note, let her run to him, he won't help her, and thought, then I need to make sure he helps her. I need to get there. I need to walk into the one place Bale Cross thinks is a dead end and turn it into something else. She had no plan beyond that. Plans required more information than she currently had. What she had was a direction and a reason, and in her experience those were the 2 things that actually mattered. She was 2 blocks from Renard Tower, she could see it, its upper floors smeared with rain and light, when the 3rd man stepped out of the doorway ahead of her. She stopped. He was large. Not theatrically large, not the kind of large that announces itself, but the kind that you register as a problem in the gut before the brain has finished its assessment. He was wearing a dark coat. His hands were visible, which told her nothing reassuring. "Miss Vash," he said pleasantly, "long walk in the rain." She said nothing. She was measuring the distance to the nearest turn, calculating whether the ribs would let her make it. "Mr. Cross would really appreciate a conversation," the man said. "Tonight, if possible. There's a car." "No," she said. He tilted his head. "That's not really." "If you take me somewhere tonight," she said, "the switch triggers in 6 hours. I built in an injury protocol. If I miss check-in and the secondary signal doesn't confirm that the miss was voluntary, the package releases." This was not entirely true, but it was close enough to true that the important parts held up. "So if I disappear, everything goes, all of it. Your name's his name, the councilman, the warehouse on Deschain Street. Everything." The man was quiet for a moment. "So you can take me somewhere," Solen continued, "and set off an event that ends your employer's operation permanently, or you can let me walk 2 more blocks. Those are the choices that exist tonight." The man's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something in his face shifted, not much but enough. He stepped back. She walked past him. She did not run, because running would have indicated that she wasn't certain, and certainty was the only weapon she had left. She walked through the rain to the entrance of Renard Tower. She walked up to the front desk and said to the security officer behind it, "My daughter is here. Her name is Petra. I need to speak to whoever is responsible for her." The security officer, young, professional, visibly uncertain, picked up a phone. Less than 3 minutes later, Drav Osai appeared in the lobby. He looked at Solen for a moment. She looked at him. She was soaking wet, visibly injured, visibly exhausted, and visibly not in any mood to be managed. "Petra," she said. "Safe, warm, drinking hot chocolate," he said. "Come with me." And as they moved toward the elevator, Drav said quietly, "Mr. Renard would like to speak with you if you're willing." "I assumed as much," Solen said. "He's not what you might expect," Drav offered, which was, in 12 years of working for Cassio Renard, approximately the most personal endorsement he had ever given anyone. Solen said nothing. She was saving what she had left for the conversation ahead. "What would you do if the only person who could protect your child was someone the world called dangerous?" Leave a comment. The answers to this question are never simple. The elevator opened onto the penthouse floor, and Solen heard her daughter before she saw her. Petra's voice, coming from the direction of the kitchen, at a volume and confidence level that indicated she was deep in an explanation of something she felt strongly about. But the thing is, the clouds that look like animals are usually the middle-sized ones, not the big flat ones, because the big flat ones just look like tables. Solen walked through the kitchen doorway. Petra looked up, and in the half-second before she controlled her face, Solen saw the relief crash through her daughter like a wave, raw and enormous and quickly smoothed over, because Petra had learned at 5 years old to smooth over the relief, which was the thing that broke Solen's heart a little every single time. "Hi, Mom," Petra said, carefully casual. "Hi, baby." Solen crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and gathered her daughter into her arms, and this time, despite the ribs she squeezed. Gloris quietly left the kitchen. Drav quietly followed. Cassio Renard stood at the edge of the kitchen and watched a woman he'd spent 30 minutes learning the outline of hold her child for a long moment, and he felt the strange double sensation of being somewhere he didn't belong and somewhere he was supposed to be, both at once, irreconcilable, real. When Solen finally straightened, she turned to face him. She was not what he had anticipated. He had anticipated someone worn down, frightened, grateful in the way that people who need things are grateful, pliable. What he got was a woman who looked him directly in the eye with the kind of assessment he was more accustomed to giving than receiving and said, "Thank you for keeping her safe. I know you have questions. I'll answer all of them, but I need a glass of water first." He almost smiled. He didn't let it land on his face, but it happened somewhere. He got her the water. They moved to the living room, Petra installed back at the kitchen island with Gloris, who had produced from somewhere a second round of toast and was teaching Petra the names of the clouds in Italian. And Solen sat in the chair across from the couch where Cassio sat, and she told him everything. Not because she trusted him, not yet, but because she had read the note on that phone and she understood that she was in the middle of something that Bale Cross had designed, and the only way to turn a trap was to understand its mechanism. And to do that she needed an ally, and the only ally available tonight was the man sitting across from her with the pale gray eyes who had, apparently, held her daughter's hair out of her face and told her she was his. She told him about the parking structure, about the councilman, about 3 years of running, about the dead man's switch in enough detail that he could verify she was telling the truth without enough detail that he could dismantle it, about the phone she'd taken and the note. When she was done, Cassio was quiet for a moment. "He's using you to get to me," he said, "not a question." "He's using me to create a situation," Solen said. "I don't know his exact intention, But the fact that he was willing to let Petra come here rather than intercept her means he wants me here, in your building, connected to you. Whatever he's planning, I'm the mechanism. And you walked in anyway. My daughter was here. He looked at her for a long time. Something moved through those pale eyes, not warmth exactly, more like the recognition of something he respected but hadn't expected to find. The dead man's switch, he said. How long have you been maintaining it? Since month 8. I update it every 30 days. Alone. Completely. He leaned back. Do you understand what Cross actually wants? Not the surface version, the reason underneath. Solen frowned. The councilman's death. He wants to make sure it never comes out. He wants the evidence, yes, Cassio said. But what he actually needs, what he's been angling for through 18 months of surveillance and 3 escalations, is to neutralize you without triggering the switch, which means he needs you cooperative, not dead. He's been trying to manufacture a situation where you have no choice but to deal with him. He paused. Coming to my building was not, as he apparently believed, a dead end. It was the first move that actually put you out of his reach. Solen went still. Why? Because Bale Cross and I have a standing arrangement. He doesn't touch anyone under my protection. That's not sentimentality, it's structural. Violating it would cost him more than he's willing to spend. I'm not under your protection. You are now, he said simply, unless you prefer not to be. There was a silence. You don't know me, Solen said. I know enough, he said. 3 years, alone, 2 moves, 1 child, a dead man's switch you've been maintaining by yourself for over 2 years without telling anyone about it. You didn't run to a shelter or a police station or a journalist. You protected your evidence, protected your daughter, and stayed functional. That's not luck, that's architecture. He looked at her steadily. I build things, Ms. Vash. I can recognize someone else who builds things. Solen looked down at the glass of water in her hands for a moment. What does your protection cost? She asked, because she was not naive and this was the question that mattered. Tonight, nothing, he said. Tomorrow we can talk about what you want to do with everything you've been carrying. He paused. But I want to be clear. I'm not interested in the evidence as leverage. Cross and I have issues of our own that predate your parking structure by a decade. If you want to take him down, I can help you do that. If you want to disappear somewhere safe and never hear any of these names again, I can help you do that too. Another pause. What I won't do is use your daughter as currency. That's not a thing I do. She looked up at him. He met her gaze without performing anything. No reassurance, no softening, no salesmanship. Just the statement standing on its own. She believed him. She didn't know why exactly, or rather she knew it was partially Petra, because Petra's read on people was better than most adults, and Petra had whispered, "Pretend you're my dad," to this man specifically. And Petra was almost never wrong about eyes. But it was also something in the way he'd said, "That's not a thing I do." Not "I would never" or "I promise," but a simple declarative statement about his own nature, offered without defense. "Okay," she said quietly. From the kitchen, they could hear Petra telling Gloris that cirrus clouds were the cats of the sky, independent, thin, and always slightly out of reach. Gloris said she'd never thought of it that way, but she supposed that was right. Cassio Renard looked toward the kitchen doorway, and for the second time that night, something moved through him that he couldn't name. The next 72 hours were the strangest of Cassio's professional life, which was saying something considerable. Solen and Petra stayed in the guest suite, Cassio's suggestion, not an imposition. He had framed it as pragmatic, and it was, but it was also something else that he didn't examine too closely. Drav ran the protection operation with his characteristic efficiency, which meant that within 12 hours they had a comprehensive picture of Bale Cross's current assets, movements, and intentions. And within 24 hours they had identified the specific mechanism of whatever play Cross was running. The mechanism was elegant, in a brutal kind of way. Cross had, over the course of 18 months, quietly acquired 3 of Cassio's supply line operators, not flipped them, not threatened them, but installed people close enough to them that he had working knowledge of the Renard Syndicate's northern distribution network. The plan, as best Drav and Thessaly could reconstruct it, was to use Solen's arrival at the tower to generate a public association between Cassio and a woman who was technically a material witness in a federal case. The implication: Cassio was harboring her. The Renard Syndicate was compromised. The federal contacts Solen had built her dead man's switch around would receive a modified version of her information, edited to implicate Cassio as a party to the councilman's death rather than Cross's men. It was, Cassio noted, genuinely clever. It used Solen's own protection mechanism against her, against both of them. "He's been setting this up for a long time," Thessaly said on the phone the morning of the second day. "This isn't improvised. Solen running to your building, he accelerated the timeline, but the structure was already there. Which means he has people watching the tower. At least 4 confirmed positions, probably more." Cassio sat with this for a moment. What does he need in order to actually execute the modification of her information? He needs her switch to go offline, or he needs someone who knows the specific format and contact list to provide a convincing duplicate. So as long as the switch is active and she's maintaining it, the modified version has no credibility. Correct. It only works if she's discredited or absent from the narrative. Then we need to put her front and center in the narrative, Cassio said. Thessaly was quiet for a second. That's a significant move. It's the only move that actually ends this, he said. Help her tell her story properly on her terms before Cross can shape it. She goes to her federal contacts directly. She delivers the information herself, with me visible in the background as someone who provided safety rather than complicity. It removes every piece of leverage he has and exposes you to federal attention. I've had federal attention before. I'll have it again. The difference is this time I'm not the subject. A pause, and it's the right thing to do. Thessaly was silent for a long enough moment that Cassio could feel her surprise through the phone. "Did you just say the right thing to do?" "Don't make it a thing," he said, and ended the call. He found Solen in the living room, early morning, sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by papers she'd apparently requested from Drav: documentation, evidence files, the carefully organized architecture of 3 years of staying alive. Petra was still asleep. The city outside was doing its pale silver morning thing, thin light pushing through the clouds, the kind of morning that felt provisional. Solen looked up when he came in. There were shadows under her eyes, but her focus was sharp. He sat on the floor across from her, which was not something he typically did, and looked at the papers between them. "Tell me how your switch works," he said. "Not the locations, the format. I want to understand how he planned to duplicate it." He showed him. They worked through it together for 2 hours, the architecture of her protection, the specific contacts, the verification system she'd built. She was precise and unsentimental about it, presenting 3 years of fear-driven ingenuity as technical information without drama, and he found himself genuinely absorbed, not because it affected his operations, but because it was brilliant. Improvised brilliance, the kind that comes from necessity rather than training, but brilliant nonetheless. "You built this alone," he said at one point. "I had nobody else," she said, matter of fact. He looked at her. The morning light was different on her face than the night had been, softer, or maybe he was just seeing her differently. "You do now," he said, and then felt the sentence land differently than he'd intended, and didn't correct it and moved on. If she felt it land, she chose not to address it either. But there was a shift in the room, small and warm and significant, the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself. They had a plan by mid-morning. They began executing it before noon. When everything is on the line and you're out of options, do you trust your instincts, or do you look for proof first? Tell us in the comments. The execution of the plan had 3 phases, and the first 2 went exactly as designed. Phase 1 was documentation. Solen spent the afternoon with Thessaly, who arrived in person, because this required in-person verification, going through everything she had, organizing it into a form that would be immediately actionable by federal investigators. Thessaly was efficient, professional, and had the specific quality of someone who had spent years around people who'd done terrible things and had long since stopped being surprised by it. She and Solen worked with the focused speed of 2 people who both understood that time was the most limited resource in the room. Cassio stayed out of it, not because he wasn't interested, but because the documentation needed to be Solen's, clean, uncontaminated by any connection to his organization beyond the basic fact of location. He managed the perimeter instead, coordinated with Drav, made 3 calls to people who owed him things, ensured that Cross's surveillance positions around the building were maintained, not disrupted, because disrupting them would signal that something was happening, but cataloged. He also, during this afternoon, found himself repeatedly in the general vicinity of the kitchen. This was where Petra was. Gloris had given her a project, sorting the pantry spices alphabetically, which Petra had immediately subverted into a project of sorting them by what she thought they smelled like, which had produced a categorization system that was entirely subjective and not at all alphabetical, but that Gloris was humoring with what appeared to be genuine interest. Cassio found himself leaning in the doorway, watching, more than once. On the 3rd such occasion, Petra caught him and said, "Do you know what cardamom smells like?" "Something warm," he said, which was inadequate. "It smells like something important is about to happen," Petra said, which was considerably more evocative and probably not wrong. "Your mom's going to be okay," he said, because that seemed like what was actually being asked. Petra looked at him steadily. "I know," she said, "she always is, but it helps when someone else knows it too." He stood in the doorway for a moment more. "Can I tell you something?" Petra waited. "I've been thinking about what you asked me, whether I'm a nice person. And I think I've spent a long time being a person who was very good at his job," he said, "and I'm not sure that's the same thing." Petra considered this with the gravity it deserved. "My mom says you can be both," she said finally. "Good at what you do and good, but you have to want both." He looked at her. Do you think I want both? She didn't answer immediately. She picked up the cardamom, smelled it again, set it down. I think you're trying to, she said, which is actually what the wanting looks like mostly. He was quiet for a moment. You're going to be absolutely terrifying when you're 30, he told her. Petra smiled, the first full, unguarded smile he'd seen from her, wide and sudden and lit up from the inside. Obviously, she said. Phase 2 of the plan was contact. Solen made the calls herself, from a secure line Cassio's team set up, to her 2 federal contacts, people she'd identified years ago as potentially trustworthy, and had been cultivating through careful, indirect means since the beginning. The calls were brief and specific. She told them she had documentation of the councilman's death, the chain of command behind it, and physical evidence she'd been maintaining in secure locations for 3 years. She told them she was ready to come forward formally and that she had secured a safe location and assistance. She did not say whose assistance. Both contacts called back within the hour. Both confirmed they were ready to receive the formal package. The dead man's switch, Solen quietly deactivated from a secondary device, the first time in over 2 years she had done so without the cold sweat anxiety of not knowing whether she'd survive long enough to reactivate it. It felt like putting down something she'd been holding so long she'd forgotten the weight of it until the absence. Phase 3 was the part that required Cassio directly. Phase 3 was bail Cross. Cross agreed to a meeting. He always agreed to meetings with Cassio, partly because of the standing arrangement between them, partly because he was, underneath the brutality, a man who believed in the value of direct conversation, and partly because agreeing was what you did when you weren't certain you had the upper hand and needed more information. They met at a neutral location, a private dining room in a restaurant that both men had independent arrangements with, clean of any affiliation, staffed that evening by people whose discretion was absolute. Cross arrived with 2 men. Cassio arrived with Drav. The rest of his security was distributed outside in ways Cross's people couldn't see. Bail Cross was 53, compact, with a particular kind of face that looked almost ordinary until you spent enough time with it to register that the eyes never quite aligned with whatever expression surrounded them. He had silver hair cut close, and he dressed without the ceremony that Cassio favored, functional, deliberately unremarkable, the clothes of a man who wanted to be assessed as less than he was. They sat, wine was poured. Cross smiled with his mouth. Cassio, he said, it's been a while. It has, Cassio agreed. I hear you've had some interesting guests recently. I have interesting guests regularly, Cassio said. It's a large city. Cross's smile didn't move. A specific guest, a woman from the Thresh, the kind with complicated history. The kind who needed a safe place, Cassio said, which is something my building provides when I decide it does. A pause. Cross turned his wine glass once. She's a liability, Cassio, for both of us. The information she's been sitting on has already been delivered, Cassio said. The dining room was very quiet. Cross's eyes shifted just slightly. Delivered. To the relevant federal contacts, this afternoon, complete documentation verified with chain of custody established. He looked at Cross steadily. Your plan required the information to be shaped before it reached anyone credible. It reached credible people first. Your modified version, when it arrives, if it arrives, will be received as a retaliation tactic rather than evidence." He paused. "The play is over, Bale." The silence stretched. "You moved fast," Cross said finally. "I had good help." Another pause. Something worked itself through Cross's face, several things in sequence, the first of which was fury, and the last of which was the cold, clear calculation of a man running numbers, and finding that they didn't come out in his favor. "What do you want?" Cross asked. "Complete cessation," Cassio said. "You pull your people from any surveillance or monitoring of Solen Vash today permanently. You make no further moves against her or her daughter. You don't approach either of them, have them approached, or commission anything that touches them in any way." He held Cross's gaze. "In return, I don't add to the documentation she's already delivered. There are things I know about your operation, Bale, that Solen Vash doesn't. We both know that. I have no interest in sharing them unless I need to. Consider this the arrangement." Cross was quiet for a long moment. "She's not worth this, Cassio," he said, and there was something almost curious in it, like he genuinely didn't understand. "That's not a calculation I agree with," Cassio said. Another long pause, then Cross set down his wine glass. "Fine," he said, "the arrangement stands." Cassio nodded once. He didn't offer his hand. Cross didn't either. They sat for a few more minutes, discussing nothing in particular, the city's weather, a mutual acquaintance's recent business troubles, in the way of men who had concluded the serious business and were performing normalcy for the benefit of the record. Then Cassio left. In the car, Drav looked at him in the rearview mirror. He said nothing. He didn't need to. "She's not worth this," Cassio repeated quietly to himself. The calculation he disagreed with. The one that had been wrong from the moment a small girl in a yellow raincoat had whispered 4 words in a parking garage. He watched the city pass outside the window. He thought he might be changing, or returning to something. He wasn't entirely sure which, but he thought either was probably better than standing still. There are moments in life when you realize you've been letting fear make your decisions. Did tonight feel like one of those moments to you? Drop a comment. We'd love to know. When Cassio came back to the penthouse, the lights in the living room were low, and Petra was asleep on the couch with a blanket tucked around her that had been folded with Gloris's precise care. Solen was sitting beside her, not reading, not working, just sitting, one hand resting near Petra's shoulder, with the proximity of someone who has spent years learning to sleep and breathe and exist with their guard half up. She looked up when Cassio entered. He sat down in the chair nearby. "It's done," he said quietly. She studied his face. He agreed. He doesn't have a better option. He paused. "The federal process will take months, it always does. But the documentation is in the right hands and the shape of the narrative is correct. His ability to interfere with it is substantially diminished." Solen was quiet for a moment. She looked at Petra, at her daughter's sleeping face. Slack and young and finally, for the first time in a long time, simply peaceful. "I need you to understand something," she said quietly. "I came here because there was nowhere else to go. I didn't come here because I expected any of this." "I know," he said. "I have a habit of not trusting people," she said. "I've built an entire life around not trusting people. It's kept us alive." "I know that too. So you should know that when I tell you that what you did tonight," she paused, and he could see her managing something, choosing her words with the care of someone who doesn't deploy them carelessly. That it was more than I had any right to expect, and that I won't forget it. She met his eyes. I won't forget it. He held her gaze for a moment. Petra told me something today, he said, about how you can be good at what you do and good, both at once if you want both. Solen's expression shifted, surprised, and then soft, the particular softness that Petra produced in her. She said that to you. She was sorting spices at the time, he said, by what they smell like. Solen made a sound that was half laugh, involuntary and brief, and it transformed her face in a way that hit him somewhere he wasn't prepared for. The exhaustion was still there, and the careful vigilance, but underneath it, or rather, briefly visible through a crack in it, was something lighter. The version of her that existed when the fear wasn't running. She likes you, Solen said. I find that remarkable, he said honestly. Don't, she said. She's rarely wrong. The city hummed outside the windows. Petra breathed in the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Somewhere in the kitchen, Gloris could be heard moving quietly, the small sounds of a household settling into night. Cassio looked at this woman who had spent 3 years carrying something enormous alone, and he thought about what that kind of solitude cost, and what it took to set it down even partially, and what it might be like to watch it be set down gradually, over time, with patience. He thought this was not the end of something. He thought it was possibly the beginning of something he hadn't known he was waiting for. You can stay, he said, as long as you need. A pause, and then because he was an honest man in the ways that counted, and longer than that if you want. Solen looked at him for a long moment, not with calculation, with the particular focused attention of someone deciding whether to believe in something they'd stopped believing in a while ago. Let's get through tomorrow first, she said. Fair enough, he said. Petra stirred slightly, resettling. Her hand in sleep found the edge of her mother's sleeve and curled around it. Cassio watched them, this woman and this child, this small, fierce unit that had survived 3 years of the worst that could be thrown at it, and he felt something settle in his own chest, something long-standing and heavy, finding a different position at last. 3 months later, the federal case against Bale Cross's lieutenants was formally opened. It happened on a Tuesday, an echo, though nobody involved noted it consciously. The documentation was complete, the witness cooperation was confirmed, and the opening filing named 4 individuals in connection with the death of Councilman Draven Foss. Bale Cross was not named in the initial filing, but his name was in the sealed addendum, and everyone who needed to know what that meant knew exactly what it meant. Solen was in the federal building when the filing was confirmed. She was wearing the good coat, the one she'd bought 2 weeks earlier in a deliberate act of forward living, the kind of thing you only buy when you've started believing in the future again. Thessaly Browd was beside her, having made the transition from Cassio's intelligence consultant to Solen's somewhat unofficial but extremely effective advocate, with a smoothness that suggested she'd been looking for an excuse. When Solen walked out of the federal building into the cold November afternoon, Petra was waiting on the steps. She was wearing the yellow raincoat. Different yellow raincoat, the right size this time, bought last month with both boots. She had her bottle cap collection in her left coat pocket, which made her left side slightly heavier and caused her to list fractionally to that side when she stood still, which was something Solen found so purely, painfully dear that she had to stop for a moment at the top of the steps just to look at it. Cassio was standing beside Petra. He was not wearing his usual Italian suit. He was wearing a regular coat, dark and practical, and his hands were in his pockets, and he was listening to something Petra was telling him with the focused attention he'd apparently been giving her since the first night, the kind of attention that didn't perform itself, that just was. Petra looked up and saw her mother and immediately said loudly, in the way of someone whose relief is too big to be managed quietly, "Mom, finally." "Finally," Solen agreed, coming down the steps. "I was only gone 2 hours." "Obviously that's too long," Petra said, and put both arms around her mother's waist with her whole body, all her weight, the way children hug when they've stopped rationing it. Solen held her daughter for a moment, her eyes closing briefly. Then she straightened and looked at Cassio. "It's done?" he asked. "Filed and confirmed." She looked at him. 3 months had changed things between them in the specific way that time changes things that are real, not dramatically, not with sudden declarations, but with the accumulation of small evidence. Meals at the same table, conversations that started practical and went somewhere else. The way Petra had started saying Cass instead of Mr. Renard, and Cassio had never once corrected it, and had, in fact, looked slightly gratified every time. The way he'd sat on the floor of his own penthouse to look at her evidence, and the way she'd noticed that he did, and what that noticing had meant. The way they had not yet said certain things out loud, and both knew it, and both were all right with the pace of it. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "You did it," he said. "I just made some of the terrain easier." "You made most of the terrain easier," she said. "Don't be modest, it doesn't suit you." The corner of his mouth moved. "Is that right?" "Obviously," said Petra from between them, having apparently been following this exchange with intense interest. Both of them looked down at her. Petra looked back up at them with the expression of someone who has seen exactly what they expected to see and is satisfied. She reached up and took Cassio's hand on one side and her mother's on the other side, with the complete calm of someone performing a completely logical action, and said, "Can we get food? Gloria said there's a place nearby that does very fast toast." "There are restaurants in this city," Cassio said, "with chefs who trained for 15 years that I would like to introduce you to." 15 years is a lot, Petra allowed. "Are they faster than Gloria's toaster?" "Nothing," Cassio said with complete seriousness, "is faster than Gloria's toaster." Petra considered. "Okay, let's go." She pulled them both forward, toward the street, toward the afternoon, toward whatever came next, and they went. Solen glanced across the top of her daughter's head at the man walking beside them. He met her eyes. Something moved in his, that particular shift she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was setting down the weight he usually carried, the one that only happened in this context, in this company. She thought about what Petra had said the first morning. "I think you're trying to," which is actually what the wanting looks like mostly. She thought that might be the truest thing about any of them. They turned the corner out of the gray official light of the federal building and into the ordinary brightness of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Veltrano City, the three of them. And the city did what cities do. It kept moving around them, indifferent to the specific weight of what had just changed, the way cities always are. But they knew. They all three knew. Some stories take 3 years to finish, and most of the time you don't know you're in one until you look back and see the shape of it, the moment in the parking garage, the whisper that started everything. The choice a little girl made based on something as simple as the look of a building in the rain, and how that choice turned out to be the most accurate one anyone in that story made. Petra had looked at Cassio Renard, the man everyone feared, the man who ran the silent empire, the man who had spent 41 years being excellent at what he did and not much else. And she had decided, in the particular way of children who haven't yet learned to talk themselves out of what they know, that he had kind eyes. She wasn't wrong. She was, as her mother had always said, almost never wrong. 4 months after the federal filing, on a Saturday morning that Veltrano City produced with unusual generosity, clear and cold and lit up like something had polished it overnight, Petra discovered that cardamom, when added to hot chocolate in the correct quantity, made it taste like, as she put it, something important is still happening. She made 3 cups. She brought one to her mother, who was sitting at the kitchen table in Cassio's penthouse. Her kitchen table now, in the way that incremental changes make things true before you've officially decided them, going through something on her laptop with the focused attention she brought to everything. She brought one to Cassio, who was at the other end of the table going through something of his own, the two of them working in the comfortable parallel silence that is one of the most intimate things that can exist between people. She set the cups down in front of each of them, climbed onto her chair, and held her own cup in both hands and looked at the two of them with the expression of someone reviewing a completed project. "This," she announced, "is a good morning." Solen looked up from her laptop. She looked at Cassio, he looked at her. "Obviously," Solen said. Cassio Renard, the most feared man in Veltrano City, the head of the Renard Syndicate, the man with the pale gray eyes that made people stop breathing, picked up his cardamom hot chocolate and took a sip, and said nothing at all, because sometimes there is nothing to say that the moment isn't already saying better than you could. Outside, the city was bright. Somewhere above it, the cirrus clouds moved thin and high and independent, the way Petra had always said they did, like cats, pleased with themselves, going wherever they decided to go, answerable to nothing. 3 people sat at a kitchen table on the 43rd floor. And that was enough. That was everything. The story began with a whisper in the dark, and it ended here, at a table in the light, with hot chocolate and the smell of cardamom and a little girl who had looked at a dangerous man and seen, correctly, that danger and goodness are not always opposites. Sometimes the bravest thing a person ever does isn't running from danger. Sometimes it's deciding, in the middle of the very worst moment, that you can see the shape of something better, and whispering toward it, asking it to meet you halfway. Petra asked. "It did. What's the one moment in your life when trusting a complete stranger changed everything? Leave your story in the comments, because every one of those moments is worth remembering."